Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Unauthorized Disclosure. I'm one of your hosts, Rania and Khalek, joined, of course, by the show's other host, Kevin Gosztola. Hello, Kevin.
Hello.
So we're really excited to welcome to the show this week. I think this is like an Unauthorized Disclosure debut for Zoe Alexandra. Yeah, we want to welcome Zoe Alexandra. She is a journalist and co-editor at People's Dispatch, which if you're not following People's Dispatch, you absolutely need to be following People's Dispatch. It's so essential to just get basic news about what's happening around the world from the correct perspective. And of course, Zoe also is like a Latin America expert. You spent several years living in Colombia. Every time, I hear from you, you've like just come back from either like Brazil or Honduras or Venezuela. So thank you so much for joining us, Zoe. I'm really excited to talk to you about many of those countries that we just mentioned.
Yeah, super glad to be here. And yeah, amazing show as always.
So I guess a good place to start would be Colombia, because there was recent local elections that, of course, didn't get so much attention in the Western press because the Western press has been so focused on the war in Ukraine. It's like nothing else is happening in the world. But what took place is pretty significant. Can you tell us what happened in Colombia, why it matters? There was like a leftist component, and then we can go from there.
Definitely. Well, this year is an elections year in Colombia. This means that people will be voting for who will be president of the country, as well as the composition of the Senate and the Congress. And so last Sunday was the first kind of step in this electoral process, which is, began a while ago, but the first round of elections was this Sunday. This process will continue until maybe May, could be June. And this Sunday, people voted for who is going to be part of the Congress in Colombia, as well as each coalition, each of the voting coalitions, so the parties that have come together to form these coalitions for the elections. They also had their primaries, and this was very important because they defined who will be the presidential candidate. Some of them defined who will be the vice presidential candidate, but also really these primaries kind of set the tone, giving an indication of how well these parties might do in the presidential elections in May. And as you said, this process didn't get that much coverage, but really it was quite significant, and not only for Colombia but also for the region. In these elections, as I said, they were electing the Congress in Colombia, and this has traditionally been controlled by many different far right and conservative parties and liberal parties. The left in Colombia has traditionally, large parts of the left have not participated in electoral politics because of the deep corruption and, of the ruling class in Colombia and the grip that they've held on institutional politics. However, this has changed over the past couple decades. There's been more participation from progressive forces. And this year, we really saw the largest participation of progressive forces, ranging from the demobilized Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia and their party, Comunes. They participated as many different citizens' parties that have been recently emerging. And a lot of these progressive forces came together to form the historic PACT alliance, which is led by Gustavo Petro, a very important figure in Colombian left politics, which we'll get to in a bit. And basically in these elections for the legislature, there was a pretty significant turnout for this alternative pact, which, as I said, has everywhere from these citizens' parties that are fighting for local change in their communities, as well as this party that comes out of one of the largest guerrilla groups in the country that demobilized and formed a political party. And this really, in a sense, this pact, the historic pact, represents the aspirations of so many sectors of Colombian society. They were able to do quite well in these elections. Increasing, this is a new alliance that they formed. It kind of is born from what was the Colombia Humana election pact that was in the last elections. And this year they won I'm just going to get the exact number because it's been changing over the last couple of days. In the Senate, they were able to win 16 seats. And in the House of Representatives, they won 28 seats. And of course, this is not a majority of the seats, but it is a significant turnout. This means they'll have ability to pass progressive legislation. They'll have ability to combat the power of the right in Colombia, which for so many years, so many decades has just held this grip on politics. And then a second aspect, which again is quite significant, is the primaries aspect. This means that people were voting, as I said, for the different the different coalitions that have been formed. There's this left-wing coalition, the Historic Pact, which contested the Congress, but also had their primary. They did extremely well in this primary election. There were over, I think, 6 million, at least over 6 million people who participated in this primary. Gustavo Petro, who is this historic leader in these past couple of decades in Colombia, who emerges from the armed struggle. He was part of the urban M19 movement. He was mayor of Bogota. He's been a senator. He got over 4 million votes in this primary race, so he will be the presidential candidate. Francia Marquez, who is a leader from Cauca, she's a Afro-Colombian leader, has been fighting against mining in her territory. She works with the Black Communities Process. She was also part of this internal primary, and she got over 800,000 votes, which is truly significant given what this really means. And so we saw across the board that the Historic Pact got a lot of support in these elections. They're likely, they're polling to do quite well in the upcoming presidential elections. Some are even saying they could win in the first round, but there has been a lot of pushback to what to the Historic Pact, and even into what's happened on Sunday. There's been allegations of fraud, but we can get into that a bit later. But generally, to say that these elections on Sunday are hugely significant, a lot of momentum behind progressive forces in Colombia, challenging the far right, which has really just controlled Colombian politics for so long.
And as far as the allegations of voter intimidation and the scare tactics and some of that, I think you probably were covering a little bit of that in your overview there, but maybe go into some more specifics and the role in which, like a lot of these Latin American countries with some tacit support or overt support from the United States historically, we see this kind of repression as the left tries to break out.
Definitely. I mean, to say that, there's voter suppression in Colombia is an understatement. I think it can't even be seen just in terms of intimidation that happens on the day of elections, but really thinking about the broader context in which politics happens in Colombia. And so this is a context wherein anyone who has a progressive position, progressive idea is immediately a target and could be under threat for violence. So since 2016, when the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia demobilized, and there was a historic peace process that was achieved, peace accords that were signed, over 1,200 human rights defenders, social leaders, and demobilized fighters from this group have been assassinated. And this is key because it's not, headline news in a lot of ways, even though it's, what social leaders in the country would call a genocide of the social movement. But they're not killing actually these really big names. They're not killing Gustavo Petro. They're not killing these very visible left figures like they did in a different moment in Colombia, where they really were trying to, get these people who, were the top leaders, but they're intimidating people at a very local level. So people who were involved in Gustavo Petro's presidential campaign in 2018, many of them were targeted and assassinated by, local armed groups, criminal groups, paramilitary groups, community leaders who fight for access to water, people who are challenging the rule of paramilitary groups wanting to have coca leaf production in their communities. This has been a constant struggle in the territories in Colombia. And these are the people who are pushing, wanting to push progressive politics in their regions, but are, of course, intimidated. So the voter intimidation, the voter suppression, the suppression of left politics really starts there, where there's no space for people to express any sort of alternative kind of view, because of course they're targeted, they're threatened. And, of course this happens in the cities as well, but when it happens in the rural countryside where no one sees it, where there's not mainstream media attention, where they don't have the support of being in a public place, I think this is already has to be considered in what we see as the suppression of these kind of movements. But that being said, in addition to this climate of fear that's already created by the prevalent violence against progressive forces, there's also been, specifically with the electoral campaign, a lot of very dicey behavior that's been happening. On the day of elections, there was a lot of denunciations that, for example, the electoral system itself, a lot of people had registered to vote, and they were not showing up in the system. This was happening in cities across Colombia, but also outside of Colombia, because Colombia has one of the largest exiled populations, people outside of the country, as well as internally displaced people. As I think for many years, it had the largest internally displaced population. And so a lot of people were having issues actually being able to even exercise their votes. And this past couple of days, there's been a lot of allegations coming out that in many of the voting tables, when they were doing the quick count, they were not counting the votes of the Progressive Historic Pact. So there's been a lot of, challenges to people actually being able to exercise their vote, to this vote counting. And of course, it has to be said that these forces which are carrying out this voter suppression, trying to block the vote of the people of Colombia, of course, have been supported by the United States historically for decades. Alvaro Uribe, Juan Manuel Santos, these people who the Colombian people consider to be war criminals because of all the human rights violations that they've carried out against their own people, were some of the closest allies of Bill Clinton, of Barack Obama, of George Bush. And their political expressions, their political parties are the ones that are, of course, carrying this forward. They have received tremendous support from the United States in military aid, military training, political support across the board. You won't see the United States threatening to invade Colombia for their human rights violations. You won't see the United States trying to challenge them and the international stage for the genocide that they're carrying out against the social movement. But these are just some of the aspects. We can go into the U.S. involvement in Colombia in a little more depth, but it is important to point out that even with all of this electoral fraud that's been carried out, the fact that the Historic Pact was able to get so many votes and have such an impressive showing actually shows that, if the votes were all counted, this would be even probably a greater turnout than we're seeing today.
It seems to speak to a trend that we're seeing around the world and across the continent too, right? Like towards a more progressive governance. And then also, could you go in more depth about the U.S. involvement? Because I think people would like to hear more of that. I mean, we know that obviously like the whole entire Colombian security apparatus is basically armed and funded by the U.S., right?
Definitely. I think to talk on your first point about the progressive wave across Latin America and the Caribbean, this is very true. It's an unprecedented moment in the sense that this is not the early 2000s. We're not seeing a wave of very far left governments, socialist presenting governments, leaders who are, outright challenging the United States, but we're seeing that progressive politics are making their way into kind of the mainstream, into the centrist areas, with the governments of, for example, Alberto Fernández of the Frente de Todos in Argentina, Gabriel Boric, who was just last week sworn in as president of Chile. With Gustavo Petro, we can also see as part of this kind of centrist, leftist, mainstream kind of wave, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, president of Mexico, also from this, centrist leftist tendency that's not going to just stand back and take everything the United States says, but is also not going to go so far as to be, a revolutionary government that's going to build a lot of strong counter-hegemonic power alongside Venezuela and Cuba. But it is a really important moment. And I think it speaks to the fact that far-right neoliberal policies are actually not possible right now. The people are feeling the impacts of what 20 years of neoliberalism has done to the continent too intensely to be able to support another government that's going to say, we're not going to guarantee education, we're not going to guarantee healthcare, we're not going to guarantee your pension, and don't even think about having, stable work. People are no longer, they can't support it. They can't they won't be able to survive. And so these leaders like Gustavo Petro, like Boric, Alberto Fernandez, who are promising not right now a radical change, but are promising that they will put the people first, that they will, not adopt these IMF-imposed policies of cutting every single social program. The people of Latin America have lived through processes of change. They've seen what's possible. They only have to look to Cuba and Venezuela and Bolivia to see that there is a better path forward. I mean, Colombia is a great example. People right now, of course, are talking a lot about the presence of Venezuelan migrants in Colombia during the, horrible economic crisis caused by the U.S. sanctions. There was a huge amount of migration of Venezuelans into Colombia because just conditions were so dire because of this stranglehold the U.S. has on the Venezuelan economy. What's interesting to note is that Venezuela is actually the country that has the largest number of Colombian migrants, over 4 million Colombian migrants living in Venezuela because of the conditions, because of violence, because of the lack of guarantee to basic rights such as housing, such as education, such as healthcare. Many people in Colombia looked at Venezuela and they say, actually, I think I can maybe survive better there. And so, they see these alternative paths. They see that it's possible to have education. Meanwhile, in Colombia, you have to pay an exorbitant amount to get higher education. It's very hard to pass into the public universities because they are so strict and exclusive, and there's not universal access. Healthcare is deeply privatized in Colombia. Álvaro Uribe Vélez, who is not only the architect of the security apparatus in Colombia and the counterinsurgency war, which has killed thousands of people, but also he was the architect of the privatization of the healthcare system in Colombia. And so decades after this, with the, of course, horrible impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, people are turning and saying, we can't do this anymore and we need a change. And this is, of course, expressed as well in the mass uprising that happened in Colombia in April, May, June of 2021, where hundreds of thousands of people across Colombia in cities and towns in every single type of location were taking to the streets to demand change. And so that's really positive. And this progressive wave, although it's different than the early 2000s, we're not having, it's not a complete return to ALBA, but it is a change in the tide. And it does open up space for a different kind of policy. We see the spaces like CELAC, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, gaining more importance. I think Gustavo Petro, Boric, they would maybe, participate in CELAC meetings. And give political weight and support behind this. And this isn't challenging U.S. hegemony by building regional integration, by building regional interdependence, alternative structures. And so I think we'll see that there is not going to be this, wave of that we saw in the early 2000s, but it will be a change in the region, and that, in any way of challenging the U.S. hegemony in the region will be positive. And to speak to what you mentioned about, just the strong U.S. Role in the situation of Colombia. Of course, there's so much to say, but I think one point that would be interesting to point out is, even just looking at the last 2 decades, the U.S. and of course, speaking to Álvaro Uribe Vélez, who I think is a crucial figure to understand when talking about Colombian politics. He is a extremely far right. I don't even think it's able to encapsulate, really succinctly say what he is, but He's a leader from Antioquia in Colombia. He was president during the 2000s. He had a very, very close relationship with the United States, and it was under his presidency that Plan Colombia was implemented in Colombia. Plan Colombia is a security agreement with the United States, which comes with millions and millions of dollars of aid. This was signed between Pastrana and Clinton, but of course came into effect when George Bush was in the White House, when Álvaro Uribe was in power, and this essentially saw a hardening of Colombia's response to the internal armed conflict in Colombia. Since the 1960s, left-wing groups took up arms to fight the oligarchy in Colombia because they had made this pact between the elites saying they would just take turns in power. They're not going to, the Conservative Party and the Liberal Party joined hands against the people, and they said, we're going to rule Colombia. These left-wing people are going to shake up too much what's happening. There's, of course, they were building on a legacy of the violence that started in 1948. But anyways, getting into the Colombian armed conflict is quite a long story. But to say that in the 2000s, the response to this conflict, the page was turned, and this agreement between the United States and Colombia, classifying the armed groups that had political motivations, that were fighting for land reform, that were fighting for a different kind of Colombian state, fighting for the expression of the voice of the people, had already suffered, genocide, extermination, the extermination of the UP, which was the Unión Patriótica, in the 90s, the political expression of the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. And Álvaro Uribe comes to office and he says, we're no longer going to treat these people as left-wing insurgencies. These are terrorist groups, these are criminal groups, and we must completely eliminate them. We will not engage in any dialogue with them. And taking this hard line of Washington that began, that in the 2000s we see kind of being exported across the world during the US's war on terror. And essentially under that pretext, not only was the insurgency treated as a terrorist group that had no, political demands or, proposals, and proceeded to kind of carry out an annihilation campaign, but also the social movements, anyone who spoke of human rights was a worthy target. And this was all done with funding from the United States, with training from the United States, creating, new battalions to protect the oil, the mining projects that many US companies, many Canadian companies have in Colombia. In addition, there was a very strong anti-narcotics program that's part of Plan Colombia. So forcing the use of crop fumigation in vast swaths of land, not only targeting, of course, the coca leaves, but of course, people's farms, huge impacts on the public health of the Colombian people. There's so many, episodes to point to in the U.S. Involvement in this period in Plan Colombia, which continues till today. U.S. bases across Colombia that saw, mass human rights violations, so many different things to say there, but really to say, I think succinctly, that the U.S. has consistently supported a policy of human rights violations in Colombia. They have never favored the people. They have always acted to support the oligarchies, to support their hold and their grip on power in the country, to protect their strategic assets of the mining projects, the oil projects, and make sure that Colombia is a steadfast ally in a continent that always looks like it's going to be moving towards progressive change.
Your knowledge always blows me away.
As does yours to me.
Well, and also my vague memory is that tracks with what we were able to learn from the WikiLeaks publications of the U.S. state embassy cables, because you see a lot of those different relationships that you're laying out there, especially with Uribe and the paramilitary forces that were empowered, and their links to extremist groups that go really deep into the military. if you give, if you support, if you care about independent media, now is the time. A year ago, 2 years ago, even 5 years ago, I think independent media was doing fine, and you didn't have an obligation or a duty to ensure that we had an independent press. But right now, we're in wartime. We need an independent press. I don't really care who you give to, but if you have a few bucks a month to spare, and I know most people are really strapped for cash, we're seeing an economic crisis brewing. 2023 looks worse at the moment. So you got to make really sound financial decisions. You may not have a lot to spare, but whatever little bit you do have to spare, have like a $5 or $10 budget for independent media. Give to someone who you know is going to be put on the cutting block. Think of those people who you want to be around during this war, and make sure that they're going to be around tomorrow and the next month and the next month and the next month. But there's another piece of good news that is worth highlighting here. Juan Orlando Hernandez is going to be extradited to the United States. And
Great guy.
To me, I'm grateful to be covering a good extradition case, one in which we can get behind the U.S. extraditing this individual. And I know that the Honduran Supreme Court put their stamp of approval on it. So maybe you want to briefly fill people in on how this unfolded and maybe give us the context of, was there a question around whether this was going to be approved?
That's a great point. And I think both Colombia and Honduras are interesting when you talk about extradition, because Colombia has also had has an extradition agreement with the United States, and it has also played a role in the national politics and how it's wielded and how it's weaponized. But I can speak to that after. But I think, yes, it is. Juan Orlando Hernandez is going to be extradited to the United States on charges of drug trafficking. There's a song that was written in this past year that's very, very popular in Honduras. When I was there covering the elections, I couldn't go anywhere without hearing this song. You're not just hearing this in the left-wing party headquarters. This is a massively popular song amongst the people, and it says, Juanchi, 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 Juanchi is going to New York. And so this song is basically talking about the fact that, they knew the National Party was going to lose the elections. And because he was so severely implicated in the drug trafficking case of his brother, Antonio Hernandez, that he was going to be extradited. And so it's interesting because, the Honduran people knew this was going to happen. This was very clear from the outset. But also it speaks to the fact that, the United States essentially made it possible for Juan Orlando Hernandez to be president twice. They supported the coup in Honduras in 2009, or orchestrated the coup, some might say. They did not challenge the de facto rule of the National Party following the coup. Juan Orlando Hernandez had clear ties, like Alvaro Uribe, to paramilitary groups, to drug trafficking groups, was clearly getting a lot of money and support by narco trafficking groups. And then in these past couple of years, while he's still in office, his brother is arrested in the United States on charges of drug trafficking to support financially the campaign of his brother. So while Juan Orlando Hernandez is in power, he's been significantly challenged. There were mass protests during his entire second term, every single year, calling for, the slogan was Fuera Ho, which means out Juan Orlando Hernandez, because not only did he commit, gross electoral fraud to get in power, he violated the Constitution, but during his second term, he carried out some of the most nefarious reforms of cutting healthcare and education even further, to repressing student protests, to approving more extractive projects. And during this whole time, the United States not only supported him, but he was an ally. So it's interesting that, now that he finished, he's another useful idiot to the United States, They knew he was involved in drug trafficking his entire time in office. His brother is in prison, meanwhile. And during the investigation of the case, it came out that there was the co-conspirator number 4. And the people in Honduras started calling Juan Orlando Hernandez co-conspirator 4 because the investigation did not reveal the name. Of course, they were not extraditing Juan Orlando Hernandez when he was president. They were not making any attempts to, hold him accountable while he was in office. But the people knew. And this also sparked mass protests. And so now, finally, now that he's out of office, now that he's done 8 years of damage to the country, the U.S. says, okay, now we can actually take action. Now we can extradite you. And so it is definitely cause for celebration because it is sending a message in some senses. But on one hand, they supported him. They did not do anything. They actually made it possible for him to be in power. He wouldn't be in power if it weren't for the support of the United States. He's wildly unpopular. There's no popular support for him. And then not only that, but they're kind of undermining the sovereignty of the Honduran state by saying, we're the only ones who can actually hold you accountable for all of the crimes you committed. And so what about the crimes that he committed in his link to the assassination of Berta Cáceres? Will he ever be held accountable for that? And I think there's something to say about extradition in the way that it violates and undermines these states, which have been made so fragile because of the United States interference in these countries. And so it is, a great cause for celebration. It's funny. There are songs about it. It almost seems, it seems ridiculous that's even happening. But I think there is something to say about how this undermines the sovereignty and what it means to actually have justice, because, he won't have to serve time for, taking money away from the Honduran people, from denying them the right to healthcare, from denying them the right to education, from making the country have 70% of the population in poverty, to, unprecedented levels of extreme poverty in the country. So I think, going forward, and while Honduras is rebuilding itself as a country, as a nation, and all of the institutions, I think the question of judicial independence, of sovereignty, is going to be a key one. And what do you do with all these criminals that were backed by the United States, that were funded by the United States, and how do you actually hold them accountable for their crimes?
Yeah, that's well said. And, since we're on the subject of Honduras, of course, something very noteworthy happened in the last few months, and that is the change of administration. Xiomara Castro won the presidency. She's the wife of the deposed president who was taken out in a coup backed by the U.S. So there was something that happened a couple months ago. I'm actually not entirely sure of the details, but there was like an attempt to undermine her before she was even I don't know if it was inaugurated, but clearly there's some sort of, as always happens when any sort of progressive figure wins a leadership role anywhere in Latin America, there seems to already be an effort to try to undermine her. So can you talk a little bit about the challenges that this new administration in Honduras faces from the right wing that was in power for so long, and also what seems to be some liberal elements in scheming with the right, if I'm not mistaken?
Yeah, I think we talked about that on the freedom side. It was crazy because, with days left for Xiomara Castro to be inaugurated, a group of parliamentarians from her own party essentially made an agreement with the far-right parties. And they said, actually, we don't want to respect the agreement that was made between Libre Party and the coalition. We want the president of the Congress for ourselves. They wanted to, but essentially they made this agreement with the far right, and they were trying to undermine this electoral agreement that had been made. I think they realized quickly that this was a bad calculation because the support of the Honduran people was behind the Libre Party, was not behind these kind of rebel legislators who decided to break off and make an agreement with the devil, because that's how the National Party is seen. I think they completely miscalculated. And with the mobilization of the Honduran people outside the Congress installations, the Libre, the intact Libre Party with the Alliance Party was able to swear in the president of the Congress that had been agreed upon, and he was the person who ended up, carrying out the swearing-in ceremony of Xiomara Castro. So this kind of completely invalidated the attempts by this group of Libre to kind of create a parallel Congress. They really tried their best. They had a whole different session. They swore in their own leadership of the Congress, but eventually this was undermined by the actual party doing it in the real installations of Congress. And they later held talks with Xiomara Castro, and I think they came to some sort of agreement. Now they've kind of fallen in line, but it speaks to the fact that this is a very fragile victory, and that when this electoral victory is achieved, it's not enough. There needs to be a complete revamping, reimagining of the institutions. These institutions have been eroded for more than 12 years under the rule of the National Party. I mean, the coup was not just the coup in 2009, but it was a whole process which saw kind of the restructuring of all the institutions of society. And so, for example, there was a large entry of the members of the armed forces into the institutions of the state, owning a lot of investments, for example, in the public companies, the ones that still exist, restructuring how the armed forces work, restructuring how all of these different branches of government work. And so when you have a progressive win government and, come in through voting, this means that, it's not only about passing some laws in the Congress, but it really means, taking on the challenge of restructuring the state. This is why, before Mel Zelaya was overthrown in 2009, the social movements in dialogue with the government of Zelaya was imagining a process of the refounding of Honduras. And Berta Cáceres, the indigenous environmentalist leader who was killed in 2016, was at the head of this process, at the forefront of trying to build a process that reimagines these institutions. A cornerstone of this is the rewriting of the Constitution, which has happened in countries across Latin America. Seeing that the constitutions and all of these institutions are kind of a relic of a past time, of a moment of bipartisan rule between the elites, and that they don't actually serve the needs of the people. And so Xiomara Castro has committed to carrying out a process of rewriting the Constitution. And this was the reason that Mel Zelaya was really overthrown, because he was daring to take on this task. And so this is something that needs not only the support of the Congress and the support of the people in power, but of the Honduran people. And this has been a longstanding demand of theirs. And that's why they voted for Xiomara Castro, because she promised these changes that are not just going to be surface, that are not just going to be, employment generation programs where people get a job for 6 months and they're out of work, but really rebuilding the institutions of the state and making, dignity of the people, putting dignity of the people at the forefront, and putting their health and well-being and access to education as principal priorities.
That's really good. So if you don't mind, we started something last week, and since I knew you were going to be here, I put together some slides for our censorship report that we're going to do, and there's been some censorship that I know you've been tracking of people who actually are in Latin America.
I'm so sick of Kevin promoting this idea that there's any censorship. We live in the freest. You live in the freest place in the whole wide world.
We're super free.
We're so free.
You're right.
I'm envious here in Beirut. All I do is envy your freedom.
It says that somebody say free, and this is America runs on Duncan. So
you're right. You go, nowhere in the Constitution does it say that I have a right to Russian state media. So
yes, exactly.
So there you go.
Polluting your brain.
But I put these slides together, and some of this happened like 12 hours after Rania and I did our thing last week. I just feel like it's worth getting in. So it may seem old, but it actually is.
Actually, it happened like almost right after we were, like a couple hours after we recorded. I was like, oh.
So first, I know this is recent and you hit it, Zoe, but this was Camilla. And Rania, you can probably do the description of Redfish that you think is most fair and accurate. What is Redfish? And then we can read this tweet.
Redfish is a media outlet that produces like social media clips and some original documentaries. I actually briefly worked for them for a few months years ago when they first started, as people who are longtime listeners of our show might remember. And it's also, it's like funded by Ruptly, which is, Ruptly is like a German company that is funded through a similar structure as RT. And Ruptly, for those who don't know, I think Ruptly was subjected to the same online censorship like that YouTube subjected RT to. Ruptly actually isn't even like a opinion service, like the way RT might be seen, like where they offer analysis and opinion on top of the news. It's actually just a wire service for video footage. And many of its clients included Western companies, media companies like AP, Reuters, I think it's like CNN. So it was bizarre that even Ruptly was banned. But anyways, Redfish is like basically a subsidiary of Ruptly, which is based out of Germany. And I'm not sure how much longer Ruptly is going to be around. I haven't heard anything about Redfish being shut down. But I mean, obviously the various platforms that they've spent years building to build an audience are being taken away from them. It's crazy, like YouTube and Facebook.
Yeah. So
they do a lot of. I also want to note that Redfish actually does, not that it makes a difference. I don't think any of the stuff should be censored, but RT is not a leftist outlet. It's obviously like it has some leftists on. It doesn't have like one ideological take, but it does like offer a platform to leftists as well as the right in the West. Redfish is an explicitly leftist anti-imperialist outlet that has a leftist anti-imperialist editorial line. And I just like, it's to call it Russian propaganda to be pro-Palestine, and which is what it is. And to do documentaries like in Colombia, for example, on like the killings of activists there. They've done documentaries in Hungary on the far right, something that I worked on, which is funny. I did that documentary, by the way, on the Hungarian far right and Israel's relationship with the Hungarian far right at a time when the Hungarian far right, and that's connected to the Hungarian government, was accused of being pro-Russia by the West. So I managed while I was at Redfish to do a documentary that was against a government that Russia was allied with. But anyways, I'll stop there. Sorry, I'm rambling.
Okay, so this tweet that we've had up there said that it's from Camilla at Telesur, who said that YouTube and Facebook prohibit us from viewing documentaries filmed by Latin Americans in Bolivia, Chile, Venezuela, Brazil, Colombia, and around our region on important issues. It's censorship of one of the few platforms which shows these perspectives. And then a second part, but not the entire thread, but also the projects produced over the last few years had nothing to do with war in Europe. They were about mobilizations and uprisings here, and they often highlighted the perspectives of the protagonists involved in ongoing revolutionary processes. So I don't know if there's anything particular you want to add to that, Zoe, but the next thing that I had was from you actually pointing out that Ina and Ina Fina Genova, and that she had been an important critical voice over the past several years, shining light on crucial issues in Latin America and the world. During last year's strike in Colombia, she did a great explainer, did great explainer videos for international audiences, but her entire channel was deleted by YouTube.
Yeah, do you have anything to add to that, Zoe?
Well, interestingly enough, RT Spanish is one of the most, it might be the most watched channel in Latin America. And Ina, for example, among many other important journalists, we're not really, I don't actually, well, now I can't even look at her whole channel and try to give an analysis of numbers, but she really covered like issues important to Latin Americans. And it was always really fascinating because I'm pretty sure she's located in Moscow, but she did these amazing explainer videos. Her format was sitting on a couch and she would have great graphics and be like, this is why the people of Colombia are on the streets. And that's who's being censored. That's who's getting their entire channel deleted. And what about the right to information in the UN Charter? This is really grave. And I think it's exactly right that, so many people have worked for these different outlets because they do provide a space for people to talk about these issues. You don't see CNN doing interviews with Colombian social leaders and, broadcasting them like Redfish would. And I think many people have touched on this, is that these outlets were able to do that. They gave people an opportunity to be journalists in the way that they want to be, to cover issues that are important to them. And so it's just ridiculous that they're, with this whole, not even to mention what is the impact of censoring and sanctioning everything that has to do with Russia in terms of the social impact, but also the informative impact of just taking away this content is so dangerous. So it's really horrible. And also these journalists have, essentially no way to share their content. Some of them lost their entire, archive of work. It's awful.
So I just want to say, I didn't tweet about it, but so you have this tweet from Abby Martin. YouTube just banned almost 600 episodes of my old show, Breaking the Set. Years-long censorship campaign culminated in tech giants purging thousands of my critical interviews and reports about U.S. empire gutted. So this is pretty devastating for Abby because all of she had a show for like 5 years on RT that was, I think, its most popular. So many interviews from an anti-imperialist perspective, has informed and radicalized, I should say, so many people, which is the reason why her show was attacked in a Defense National Intelligence report. Actually went after Breaking the Set, specifically named it as promoting radical discontent. That's the wording they used. So this is about more than just so-called Russian propaganda and trying to shut down the Russian narrative on Ukraine. It's also being used to take away informative, like leftist, anti-imperialist content under the guise of fighting Russian disinformation or whatever. And I will say, I didn't make a thing of it, and I'll explain why, but Soapbox's entire YouTube page was taken down. And like, I don't have as much content as like Breaking the Set does, that to be like as devastated about. And also I backed up, like I've saved like every segment I ever made. But for Soapbox, I did make a couple of documentaries, one of which was about like a sewage crisis in rural Alabama, where people had sewage like basically floating in their yards because they couldn't afford proper septic tanks and the city wasn't taking care of it. And I also did one on homelessness in Washington, D.C., like basically homeless single mothers. Mm-hmm. So that you can't see that on YouTube anymore. And that's like a real shame. I mean, it's like, why is that content Russian propaganda? And all the segments that I made from Beirut, Lebanon, about issues from Syria to Lebanon to Iraq to Iran to China to some, I don't even know if I ever did anything about Russia. I might have, but the point is, like, all of that taken down and people, are cheering it and justifying it. And one of the reasons I was reluctant to make a big deal about it, and I'm like a little bit embarrassed to say this, is, and this shows you that it works, is like the labeling of people's accounts as Russian state-affiliated media. And in the past, I have worked for what has been labeled Russia state-affiliated media, and I'm afraid of, like, I've never in my life been so scared to say the wrong thing or to draw attention to my past work experience, because I'm afraid that I'm either going to be censored or my accounts will be deleted or my accounts will be given the scarlet letter of state-affiliated media that you can never get rid of. And that's where we're at right now. That's where the West is at right now.
Mm-hmm. Let me just squeeze this in, and then Zoe will give you the final comment on all this stuff we've talked about. But this was revealed last week by YouTube, and I think it's actually something I want you to contextualize within Latin America, because this is going to be a policy. So I'll read it. There's a community guideline that YouTube updated or changed to prohibit content denying, minimizing, or trivializing well-documented violent events. Again, that's denying, minimizing, or trivializing well-documented violent events. We are now removing content about Russia's invasion in Ukraine that violates this policy. And then this was paired with the fact that they announced that they've removed more than 1,000 channels and over 15,000 videos under this policy around misinformation, graphic content, and more. And then they say also that while doing the censorship, we're pairing it with boosting corporate news sources that are breaking news in top news shelves. That's CNN, NBC News, there's Reuters videos, that's BBC. All of those that are confirmed are on their homepage, receiving more than 17 million views in Ukraine, etc. But the reason, I ask you this is to go back to say minimizing, denying, or trivializing well-documented violent events. Well, I can think of a lot of allegations against those states being supported by the U.S. government, being having paramilitary groups involved, having groups not the Azov in Ukraine, but let's say a similar Azov type group in a Latin American country who you may want to post about. I can think of Syria writing about jihadist groups that Rania and I have spent a lot of time on, alleging that they've engaged in violence and finding ourselves being accused of, I can also see the other side of it where groups have been accused of violence and we say, well, no, there's no evidence. We do the kind of reporting that Seymour Hersh had done on Syria or that other journalists have done on Latin America in the past to defend left-wing groups and to say, no, they're not really engaged in that kind of heinous crimes against humanity or whatever, however the U.S. is framing it in order to delegitimize them. And then we get censored by YouTube for having skepticism.
Yeah, I mean, it's wild. And I think it speaks to so many things, both about the nature of our digital media landscape today, which thrives on virality, on shock, on awe, on, really on misinformation. We're actually not supposed to have, well fact-checked pieces. We're not supposed to kind of wait until the confirmation is given. We're supposed to have the most outrageous thing. But at the same time, when you said the violent content, minimizing this, I'm just thinking of the images, going back to where we started with Colombia, of the images during the uprising last year. I was at all hours seeing images of, decapitated people who had been burned to death, not only by far right-wing groups, but the police were engaging in so many acts of violence. Over 80 people were killed. And this was being broadcast live, and I don't think the tech overlords, I don't think the United States was taking any, action in response to this. Of course, not to say that this should be censored, but that the fact that some violence has the ability to change policies and has the ability to make people act, I think is something to say. And I mean, going back to the YouTube announcement, I think it really solidifies a policy which they've wanted to put in place, but really haven't had the justification to do so. And this statement is so vague. It could mean anything. I mean, I can interpret it in 1,000 ways. I mean, what does it mean to be trivializing this? Does this mean that you have to be talking about it at all times and condemning Russia at all times? It can go in any direction possible. And I think it gives them kind of the backing, the justification to really crack down in whatever way they see fit. I think it gives them this blanket, reason to say, this does that, this, we can no longer allow this to exist. This is, violating our policy, because it could really apply to anyone. It's so vague. And I think we're in a new moment of what it means to make media that challenges the hegemonic narrative. We're at the same time grappling with the limits of these digital platforms, and it's going to be an interesting moment in how we challenge the censorship and how we challenge, the algorithms. I know that both of you have been dealing with this, and how we how we challenge the monopoly over dissemination of information and access to information.
Well said.
Thank you, Zoe. So as you go, you want to plug your website and tell everyone where they can find your work?
Yeah, please check out People's Dispatch. It's tough times, and we need to be learning about people who are on the ground, mobilizing in their communities, mobilizing in their countries, trying to make change at all costs, against all odds. Get the perspective you won't see in any mainstream media of the working class, of movements on the ground. And do follow us on all platforms. Check us out, support us.
Zoe, also you have a show that you guys host every week, like live stream,
yes.
right? With
yes,
DJ and
coming
Prashant?
up in 1 hour. Give the people what they want. Your weekly movement news roundup. If you've missed all of the news during the week, because it's possible, you can listen to this very succinct 30-minute show on podcast platforms as well as YouTube and Facebook. And if I do say so myself, it gives you a pretty good capsule of everything that's happened, and with analysis from myself, Vijay Prashad, and Prashant of People's Dispatch. We have a fun time, and we think we do a pretty good job of informing about the news that the mainstream media doesn't want to tell you.
All right. Well, thank you. It was great to talk with you.
Always great to talk to you guys. Have a good day.